So my name is Michael Pope. I'm the president of the Historical Society, and I wanted to preview a few of our upcoming attractions before I introduce our author who's over there selling books. So, by the way, I'm going to be speaking for the perfect amount of time to buy a book. If you want to walk up, stand up, walk over there and buy a book, I'm going to be speaking for the exact amount of time it takes to buy a book with credit. If you have cash, it's faster. All right. Wow, gosh, I'm not that, my vision's not that great that I could do this in the dark. Okay, all right. Just want to preview a couple of our fun upcoming events. So if you're a fan of the Historical Society, if you come to our meetings, you know that we love to be here in the Lyceum. There's another building in Alexandria that has a similar name with columns out front. People often get them confused. We're going to be having an event with our friends over at the Athenaeum. Don't get it twisted. It's the Athenaeum, and it's going to be next week, Friday of next week. We're really excited about this. This is one of our signature 250 events. So the Alexandria Historical Society is doing a bunch of events for the 250th, the semi-sesquicentennial. I'm going to say that again. Semi-sesquicentennial? Did I get that right? Okay. Semi-quincentennial. You know what? I shouldn't have even bothered with it. All right. It's halfway to 500. Is that basically semi 500? Okay. So 250. The 250th event, one of our signature events, is going to be at the Athenaeum next Friday night. It's called Wooden Hulls and Ragtag Fleets. It's a naval history, and we are going to have a great panel with a military historian, Thomas Shepard, and a naval historian, Chris Martin. We're going to talk about the people that were on the ships of the Continental Navy and the ships of the Continental Navy. We've got a great expertise on this panel. You'll definitely want to come check this out for our 250th event. We're also going to have a representative from the Providence there, so we're really excited. This is, again, one of our key signature 250 events. You definitely want to check out the event next Friday night at the Athenaeum, not the Lyceum. Go to the Athenaeum. 6:30 doors open, 7:30 event, and we are really excited about that. Actually, before I move on, we might have maybe some rum there. I don't know if we've actually cleared this or got the license. We might have to get a license for this, but apparently there was Pusser's rum. So the person in charge of the logistics of the ship, they were in charge of the rum, of course, right? So the Admiral Vernon apparently had his logistics guy create a cocktail, like an early cocktail that had rum, brown cane sugar, and lime juice. And so that's the history. That's the history. I'm thinking maybe, I don't know who we have to get a permit. I don't know how that works, but hopefully we'll get that happening because that sounds like fun. All right, and then the weekend after that, so June 13th, Saturday, June 13th, we're going to be at Sails on the Potomac. Raise your hand if you're looking forward to Sails on the Potomac. All right. The Alexandria Historical Society is going to be there on Saturday. This is a multi-day event, and you're definitely going to want to come out to Sails on the Potomac. But Saturday, specifically, you're going to want to come out because the Alexandria Historical Society is going to be there at the 250th History Village. This is going to be on Waterfront Park, and this is where all the fun is going to be. We're going to be there all day Saturday, so Pam Cressy, raise your hand in the back here. She's going to be there. Scott Viereck, raise your hand. Okay, so in fact, Scott, if I could ask you to come up here, because if you go to Sails on the Potomac on Saturday, one of the things that you'll be able to do is get a demo of our new digital museum from Scott Viereck.
So yeah, thank you, Michael. As some of you might have heard, over the past year, the Alexandria Historical Society has been building our own digital history museum all about Alexandria's history. Totally free and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. As you can see, I've got it up here on my iPad thanks to the Lyceum's free Wi-Fi. So if you come down to the Sails on the Potomac, you'll be able to get a sneak peek of the museum. It's going to launch to everybody in July. And this is a museum that's going to cover all of Alexandria's history, from the indigenous communities that called it home for thousands of years, to more recent events like Hazel, who is drilling underneath Old Town to help deal with the city's, sewage problem. So a lot of history that we'll be covering here. This is a museum that's going to grow over time. So very excited to share that all with you. And again, if you want a sneak peek, come see us at the History Village in a couple weeks. All right.
All right, Hazel, I can dig it. All right. Somebody around here has a sense of humor. All right, so you definitely want to come to Sails on the Potomac, and we have a ton of events. I just want to quickly preview other future events that we've got. In June, we're going to hear from Richard Bell. I think we might not even have slides on this. It's so far in the future. Oh, yeah, we do. Okay. This is going to be another one of our key signature 250th events. Oh, gosh. Semi-quincentennial? Is that right? Okay, all right, fine. Another one of our key 250th events. Richard Bell is going to talk about his book, American Revolution and the Fate of the World. Is that a great title or what? Seconded only by the title that our author is going to be talking about tonight. And then the week after that, in June, we're also going to have a walking tour of the Old Presbyterian Meeting House from our own Dave Hybe. Raise your hand, Dave Hybe. Yes, looking forward to that. So. We have so many upcoming events, including one that we don't have on the calendar yet, and I wanted to raise it here to this group to see if there was any interest in having a cocktail hour. So you may have been to the Office of Historic Alexandria cocktail hour. We're thinking about having our own, so I just wanted to raise it to the room and get some reaction. So come talk to me afterwards if you're interested. Pam Cressy described it as take a bite out of history or think and drink. I had an idea that was like stump the society, like ask a question that's going to stump us. I don't know that I sold Pam on that, but and we're thinking about doing this at the Providence. There's that bar attached on the floating pier thing attached to the Providence. That's where we're thinking about having our Alexandria Historical Society happy hour. Maybe like a Monday or a Tuesday. Let me know what you think about this. Send me an email or talk to me after. So Pam had some ideas for questions. Okay, so where did the name Alexandria come from? Do we know that? Do we know it's the Alexandria? What do we know about the Alexandria factory? Where was the original tobacco port? Why did George Washington draw that map? And is it true that Alexandria was really founded by Scots? Good questions, right? Stump the society. We can have big debates about all those questions among others. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to ask you to become a member. If all those things I just said interest you, you definitely want to become a member of the Historical Society. If you want to come to any of the events I just talked about, including that naval history event, you want to let us know, send us an email so we can make sure that we've got everybody on the list. All right, now, she's almost sold out of books, so now's the best time to... no, wait, actually got a few more that you could sell after the speech is over with. Great, okay. All right, so I'm going to introduce our speaker. First, I'm going to tell you a little bit about her book. All right. Think about those movie reels, when you go to watch the movie and there's the coming attractions, and they say, in a world where the pursuit of John Wilkes Booth led to a barge known as the Black Diamond blocking the Potomac River. People always say that no one died in the pursuit of John Wilkes Booth, if only that were true. And to tell us more about this event, we are joined by our speaker tonight who is signing a book, so I'm going to draw this out as much. Anyone else want to buy a book? Cash is the easiest way to buy a book, but she might be able to take credit as well. All right, so I'm going to introduce her a little bit. And she is a recent award winner. Yes, she recently won an award. Give her a hand. From St. Mary's County in St. Mary's, Maryland, where she won the award for the Historical Preservation Award. So definitely congratulate her for it. She is going to talk about her book. She's also, she runs 4 museums, okay? So this is like the head of museumdom in St. Mary's, Maryland. And I want you to put your hands together and welcome our speaker tonight, Karen Stone. All right, while they get the screen working, I want to put out a plug for just one quick thing. So we are going to be at Sails on the Potomac on Saturday. Everybody in this room is going to Sails on the Potomac. All right, let me put this plug in. Come by the Alexandria Historical Society tent. Volunteer for like 1 hour, 2 hours. We need people. We need bodies on the ground. Historical Society people to be at our tent representing at Sails on the Potomac. So if you're an Alexandria Historical Society member, if you're a friend of the Alexandria Historical Society, put in an hour of volunteer time, 2 hours of volunteer time at Sails on the Potomac. Come find our tent. We've got a great new tent. It says Alexandria Historical Society right on the top. It's very nice. So find our tent, volunteer for 1 hour, 2 hour, and represent for the Alexandria Historical Society. All right. I think we've got our slideshow up, so let's hear it again for Karen Stone.
Thank you so much, all of you, for coming out tonight. This is really exciting to see so many people, and I'm glad to finally be here. We've been working on this for quite a while, so I am glad to be here. I don't know where I'm supposed to point this, but it's...
The screen or toward the computer. Try the other direction,
Oh, there we go. Okay. It's always been said that not a single life was lost during the hunt for John Wilkes Booth. And that's said with pride as it should be, but it's just not true. In the 1860s, life on the Potomac River was quite different than it is today. And instead of the calm, open waters that we see most days, probably today not so much, might have been a little rough out there today, the river was the front line of battle. The Potomac was the main lifeline out of Washington, D.C., and for the federal government, it was the dividing line between the warring sections of North and South. This is the story of that river and of the men whose lives were lost in the aftermath of the Civil War in the hunt for presidential assassin John Wilkes Booth. This is also the story of two vessels, a coal barge named Black Diamond and a sidewheel steamer known both as the JWD Pence and Massachusetts. Both were in service to the Quartermaster Department, and both lost men on that night. In the spring of 1865, there were a total of 612 vessels being chartered by the Quartermaster Department. And at that time, the Quartermaster Department was not yet the specialized department that we know it today. They didn't have their own transportation, they didn't have their own vessels, they didn't have their own vehicles. Everything they used, they had to borrow, steal, consign, or just take. Or they could rent it. They relied on contracted workers and also detailed soldiers to work on board these vessels that were hired or commandeered for transporting troops, most especially, and also for supplies. Now, in 1861, the United States Capitol was in danger. The railroads were obstructed, and no mode of transporting troops and goods existed except on the water. So the War Department began arranging for ships to be placed into service by whatever means available. And 2 days after Virginia voted to secede from the Union, President Lincoln confiscated 4 steamboats belonging to the Potomac Steamboat Company, which was part of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railway. And at least 3 of those ships were put into service for the federal government. That same day, Captain Richard F. Loper was asked for his help in obtaining boats for transporting troops destined for Washington. Loper was a shipper out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but he was known to the War Department because he had supplied vessels for them during the Mexican War. So for most of April 1861, Loper spent his time finding and chartering vessels for the Quartermaster Department, eventually including one of his own, the Black Diamond. Under the system at the time, the Quartermaster Department paid the owners of the private vessels that they chartered. The owners were then responsible for paying the captains and the crews. And that eliminated the pension and claims rights for all of the men serving on there as crew because they were civilian employees. It was also the owner's responsibility to keep the vessel in good repair and to outfit it with the supplies needed for service. Now, the pilotage and port fees were paid for by the government. The Black Diamond was an iron-hulled, wood-class, second-class steam propeller barge, which is a fancy way of saying the hull was made out of iron, but the iron had rusted, so they put wood over top of the iron. It could carry about 200 tons of freight, and it was built in 1842 in New York for the Delaware and Raritan Canal Company as a coal transport barge, which is why it's called Black Diamond. It was built by Hogue and Delamater Iron Works, and it was run by a grasshopper-type engine. If that means anything to anybody, if you ever hear boats on the water, it's a kind of noise. Yes, exactly. She was making little hand motions. And it was owned by Loper's Philadelphia Steam Propeller Company. This is not the Black Diamond. There are no pictures of the Black Diamond, but it looked just like that. It was put into service for the Quartermaster Department in December 1862 and remained in contract until April 1865. Now, it stipulated that the Black Diamond was to be used for the hauling of freight and to be generally available for hire as needed. How many of you have other duties as assigned on the bottom of your job descriptions? That's what it said at the bottom of this contract. Overall, the Philadelphia Steam Propeller Company was paid $30,150 for the Black Diamond's time in federal service. The captain the entire time was John Meredith, and the engineer was John Husted. Usually they carried a crew of 5 men. Now, once chartered, the Black Diamond continued mostly to carry coal up and down the Potomac River between Alexandria and Washington, D.C., and all the way down to Piney Point and Point Lookout at the mouth of the river on the bay. There were naval depots up and down the river where they needed the coal supplied. It sometimes went as far as City Point, Virginia, which is out and around and up the next river down. It also, besides coal, sometimes carried salted pork and beef for the Army, and also was sometimes chartered out to the Adams Express Company, which was the UPS of the day. They had the only federal contract for delivery of the United States mail and packages at the time. And at least once it went all the way to Baltimore, carrying Army supplies. Now, the other vessel is the Massachusetts, which this actually is. It was known as the John W.D. Pence while it was in civilian service. For some reason, the Quartermaster Department registered as the Massachusetts, but they also sometimes called it the John W.D. Pence. So when you look through the records, you have to look under both names and make sure you're not looking at the USS Massachusetts, which is a whole different boat. So it's very complicated. It was a civilian passenger vessel before the war and worked up and down the Chesapeake Bay. It was built in New York also in 1836 and ran the Potomac River and the bay beginning in the 1840s, running from Alexandria all the way to Baltimore. And the owners of this were Samuel J. Pence and John D. Pence of Baltimore. And the captain on this boat was Columbus Calk. Now, this steamer was chartered in 1863 to be used as a troop transport vessel. The crew were paid by the owner, not the government, and it was based also in Alexandria and Washington. It made regular runs all the way to City Point and sometimes to Fortress Monroe down in Virginia. And it remained in charter service until June of 1865. And resulted in $48,634.06 of payment while in government service. The use of vessels as troop transports began in 1861 when they were used to carry Sherman's battery. As the war progressed, more and more vessels were needed to move the troops from place to place, and this became particularly important in 1862 during McClellan's Peninsula Campaign. That was the first large-scale offensive movement in the Eastern Theater. Now, by the end of the war, transport vessels were running daily between Washington and City Point, Virginia, carrying both passengers and mail. Now, all of the contracts for all of the ships in service to the Quartermaster Department stated that war risk was to be borne by the United States, and that marine risk was to be borne by the owners. So if a vessel was damaged by enemy shelling or was captured, then the government would pay. But if the damage was the result of a storm, pilot error, collision with another vessel that wasn't an intentional ramming of an enemy, then the responsibility was the owners. And this is going to be really important later. Now, each vessel traveling the waters of Maryland, including the Potomac River, which you remember is owned by Maryland, is required by law to have a duly trained and certified pilot on board. The Association of Maryland Pilots was formed in 1852. However, the first pilot laws actually went into effect in the 1640s. So this was a long-standing tradition on the waters of Maryland. Now, while the pilot is on board, he is the temporary master and is charged with the safety of the vessel and the cargo and the lives of those on board. Again, that's going to come into play in a little bit. Now, this applied to charter vessels as well as the U.S. Navy's Potomac Flotilla vessels and every other boat running up and down the waters. Now, on April 12, 1861, Fort Sumter was fired on. President Abraham Lincoln issued a call to arms on the 15th, and the governments in the border states like Maryland and Virginia needed to choose a side. Maryland's governor, Thomas Holliday Hicks, refused to answer Lincoln's call. He wrote to Secretary of War Simon Cameron that there were some organized military forces in Baltimore, and they were very much for the South. They had taken possession of the armories and had all the arms and ammunition. So, I therefore think it prudent to decline for the present in responding affirmatively to the requisition made by President Lincoln for 4 regiments of infantry. In other words, I'm not sending you any troops. We're staying out of this. We want nothing to do with it. On the 17th of April, Virginia declared that it would leave the Union, which made Maryland essential to the defenses of Washington, D.C. On the 19th, riots broke out in Baltimore between Confederate sympathizers and the federal troops trying to get to Washington. The next day, President Lincoln sent a message to both Governor Hicks and Baltimore's Mayor Brown, asking them to come to Washington for a little chat. Lincoln wanted to keep the peace there. He didn't want anything to happen. Maryland said, we'll come talk, but you're not sending any more troops through Baltimore or anywhere else. That's just not going to happen. And they said that the riots were just Marylanders defending themselves when they saw federal troops coming in armed. So they were just defending themselves and their local citizens. It wasn't a big deal. It really was a big deal. So at this time, the Maryland legislature only met in even years. So they weren't set to meet in 1861. But Governor Hicks was being urged to call a special session because there was a lot going on. And Marylanders were pushing both ways. Secede, don't secede, secede, don't secede. So he called a session in late April. Now, President Lincoln got word that they were going to meet, and he told General Winfield Scott to be ready. Don't do anything in advance, but if they decide to secede, you got to be there right now. Be ready to go. But he said, don't do anything yet. But if you have to go, go, including bombarding the cities. Do it if you have to. So the General Assembly was meeting in Frederick because of all that was going on in Baltimore and Annapolis. They thought they would be safe out there. Now, Governor Hicks continued to promote neutrality. He really just wanted everybody to go away. Leave us alone. He said that if we stay neutral, then the warring sides would be forced to transfer the field of battle from our soil so that our lives and property may be secure. We don't want to fight on either side. So the Assembly ultimately voted 53-13 against secession, but not because they weren't sympathetic, but because they were having constitutional arguments. They didn't think they had the constitutional right to secede, so they didn't. Then people said, well, maybe you should take it to the people of Maryland, put it to a referendum, and it probably would have been a very different decision had they let the people vote, but they didn't. But the people living in the lower Potomac, St. Mary's County, where I'm from, had been interacting with the Virginians since the arrival of Lord Baltimore and the first Marylanders in 1634. Many people owned land on both sides of the Potomac. They intermarried, sometimes more than once, and they knew each other from working side by side on the water. Those relationships didn't end with the outbreak of hostilities, and the federal government knew that. One of the people that married more than once across the river was George Washington's great-great-great-grandfather. Maybe there's another great in there. He married a St. Mary's County girl, and when he died, he came back and married his sister. Found a good one, I guess. Now, in order to keep the people in southern Maryland from continuing to trade and to try to interrupt the enemy communications that were going back and forth across the river and to get all of the enemy boats and the smuggling boats off the river and to protect the loyal citizens, Union Naval Commander James Ward proposed a flotilla, and he was going to put it in the Chesapeake Bay and the Potomac River specifically. So it was formed and arrived in May. Then Lafayette Baker was sent down here by Postmaster General Montgomery Blair. He published a notice in the St. Mary's, Maryland Beacon saying that President Lincoln has interdicted commercial intercourse with the so-called Confederate States, which was to include written correspondence. The people of southern Maryland didn't care. All of their post offices had northbound mailboxes and southbound mailboxes. They were just sending mail and newspapers and everything else they wanted back and forth across the river. Then Confederate batteries began to line the shores of the Potomac in July after the first Battle of Manassas. That created a virtual blockade of the river, not a literal blockade, but a virtual blockade, because the Union Navy was afraid to allow ships up there because they were going to be shot at and sunk. So this cut off the primary federal supply line. Ships now had to travel to Baltimore, unload, reload onto railroad cars, and then proceed to Washington, D.C. So if Maryland secedes, now they can't get to Washington by land or by sea. So this was a problem. So Governor Hicks decides, I'm going to call the legislature together again, and we're going to talk about this once more in September. Now the Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, says, no, not happening. The passage of any act of secession by the legislature of Maryland must be prevented. If necessary, all or any part of the members must be arrested. So 1/3 of the legislators were arrested and taken to Fort McHenry. That prevented a new vote and brought the special session to an end before it even began. But the people of southern Maryland didn't care what the state assembly did. They continued dealing with their neighbors across the river, and so in October, Lafayette Baker, chief of the U.S. Federal Detective Police, came to southern Maryland. They hadn't stopped the mail, they hadn't stopped the smuggling, so now Lafayette Baker came down and said, all right, I'm in charge. I'm going to do something. He brought with him 3 companies from General Hooker's 3rd Indiana Cavalry, and they were, if necessary, to permanently occupy the area. They found it necessary, and they stayed for 4 years in southern Maryland. But still, the nightly smuggling of supplies and men to Virginia continued. which led to General Benjamin Butler's arrival in April of 1862, at which point he declared martial law across the state. But even then, the sympathetic Maryland still said, yeah, whatever. We don't care. So with all of this going on, with the smuggling and the unrest and the illicit activity and the mail going back and forth, it was only natural that when John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Abraham Lincoln on April 14th, 1865, the manhunt focused on southern Maryland, and the government called on the Potomac Flotilla for aid. Now, by 1864, the Potomac River had been laid out in divisions by the flotilla commander. The vessels were each assigned to a specific area, and they were to cruise their sections from dusk until dawn, because they're worried about the smugglers at night. They don't care what's going on during the day. They're worried about the smugglers. And then they would stay at anchor during the day, but they were never to anchor in the same place twice in a row. So they were trying to keep everybody off guard. They were not to strike any bells at night, and on foggy or misty nights, the guard was to be doubled. This was all with the idea that they were going to stop the nightly smuggling of goods and men. Secretary of War now is Edwin Stanton. He issued a War Department bulletin on April 22nd, not long after Lincoln's assassination. The counties of Prince George's, Charles, and St. Mary's, all three along the Potomac in southern Maryland, have during the whole war been noted for hostility to the government and their protection to rebel blockade runners, rebel spies, and every species of public enemy. He had such a way with words. The murderers of the president harbored there before the murder, and Booth fled in that direction. If he escapes, it will be owing to rebel accomplices in that region. The military commander of the department will speedily take measures to bring these rebel sympathizers and accomplices in the murder to a sense of their criminal conduct. So the hunt was on. They were determined. They were going to get these folks. So the entire peninsula of southern Maryland was searched, but they found nothing of note. The 8th Illinois Cavalry was ordered there on the night of the assassination, and one of them wrote, "The country is so thoroughly picketed and searched that a rabbit would have hardly made his escape through the lines without being discovered." And a call went out to increase the strength of the Potomac Flotilla, hoping to create such a dense picket line that no boat would be able to get through. And one of the vessels assigned to join them was the Black Diamond. It did not know that it was too late or that this would be its final mission. Flotilla Commander Parker also redirected his existing boats, sending 10 gunboats and armed sloops to patrol the Potomac River from Mattawoman Creek to the mouth, with orders to seize all boats. And he assigned another 10 gunboats to cruise the Chesapeake Bay between Point Lookout, Maryland, and the eastern shore. They were to intercept all boats bound down the bay. And he sent 4 fast boats to cruise along the Maryland coast from Annapolis to Point Lookout, and 7 boats to guard the coast of Virginia from Point Lookout to the York River. So he felt that the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay were being vigilantly guarded, but told Secretary Wells that twice the number of boats constituting the flotilla could not prevent a canoe from crossing at night from Maryland to Virginia. He therefore called for more boats, intending to fill in the gaps between all the vessels and form a literal blockade, making it impossible for even the smallest boat to escape notice. But by then, as Commander Parker was establishing his picket line of vessels, Booth and co-conspirator David Herold were hiding in the swamps of Charles County, waiting for the right moment to cross the Potomac River. They were being aided by Thomas Jones and Samuel Cox, both Confederate agents. On Friday, April 21st, Jones heard a local man proclaim, "I have news. Those fellows have been seen down in St. Mary's County." Now, Jones knew this would pull all of the troops out of the area, And so at dusk, he went to where Booth and Herold were hiding and told them the time had come for them to cross. Now, we will never know whether that was a plant and Jones had had asked this guy, paid him to come in and pull the troops out, or if the guy just really had heard that and Jones just happened to be there. We will never know, but it worked. Now, it was a damp and cloudy night with a gray fog rising from the marsh. The wind was calm, but had been blowing all day, and there was a swell on the river due to the flood tide. So at about 10 p.m., the two conspirators took Jones's skiff and started on their way. But the strong flood tide carried them upstream and forced them back to the Maryland shore, approximately 12 miles north of where they had started, near the home of a Confederate sympathizer who was known to Herold. Now, if you know this story, you know there were supposed to be other men with them, specifically Atzerodt, who knew the river and was a really strong guy, and Thomas Lewis Powell or Payne as well. Big guy, not real smart, but really big. Instead, you end up with David Herold, who's a gross chemist's clerk, and John Wilkes Booth, the actor. They don't have any idea how to row boat. They have no strength at all. They're just kind of nice to look at and, pleasant people, but this was not for them. They needed those other guys that they had left behind in Washington. So the next day, Saturday the 22nd, while Booth and Herold were resting from their first attempt to cross the Potomac and waiting for their second chance, 300 Union soldiers were marching from Camp Parole, Maryland to Alexandria, Virginia. They were going to board a troop transport the next day. And Quartermaster Lee was looking for vessels and men to send to the Middle Potomac to join the flotilla and keep Booth's crossing from happening. But they were too late. Booth and Herold were successful on their second attempt and arrived on the Virginia shore early Sunday morning. As we already know, one of the vessels that answered Quartermaster Lee's call was the Black Diamond, which normally carried a crew of 5, but now was taking on an additional 10 men, plus one military captain, to be on guard duty. They received their special orders Sunday, April 23rd. Now, the Massachusetts was scheduled to make one of its standard runs between Alexandria and the Union stronghold at Fort Monroe, Virginia that day with the 300 men from Camp Parole. They were all going to rejoin their regiments to complete their terms of service before either mustering out or continuing service as part of the occupying forces in the South. So remember, the war is ostensibly over. Appomattox has already happened. Most of the men on the Massachusetts were recently paroled prisoners of war, mostly from Andersonville, Georgia, but a few had also been held in Danville and Richmond, Virginia. All had then been sent to Camp Parole to prepare for their return to duty. A few others were returning from hospital stays and extended medical furloughs. Now, 15 of the 30 men that I've identified as lost from the Massachusetts came from regiments captured at Plymouth, North Carolina on April 20th, 1864. This battle was the last major victory for the Confederacy. Union forces had taken the town in May of 1862 and had been using it as a base for raids all over eastern North Carolina. But with the help of the ironclads Albemarle and News, Confederate General Robert Hoke laid siege to the town in the spring of '64 and captured it, along with 2,364 Union soldiers. Now, the prisoners were relieved of their arms and equipment and issued 4 days' worth of rations before settling in for the night. And about noon of the 21st, their march began, and they marched more or less every day until the 25th, when they arrived at Tarboro, North Carolina, where they were held in the stock pens until the morning of the 29th, when they marched to the railroad cars, which took them to Andersonville prisoner of war camp, which they finally reached on May 2nd. Now, during their 5 months at Andersonville, they watched fellow soldiers die of disease and starvation. They got beaten to death, or get beaten to death by their fellows over a scrap of food, a watch, or a piece of firewood, be shot by a guard for stepping over the deadline, whether intentionally or by accident. And they heard many rumors and suffered many disappointments about when their exchanges would take place. Finally, on September 1st, they were at last taken out of Andersonville and began their long journey north. Now, most of the enlisted men held in Danville and Richmond had been captured during the siege of Petersburg, others at Monocacy, and one by John Singleton Mosby near Newtown, Virginia. They were all sent to Danville first, and then in February were transferred to Richmond due to overcrowding. And when all of them were released, they went to Camp Parole, Maryland, by way of College Green Barracks in Annapolis. When the soldiers arrived, they were met at the docks by men and women of the Christian Commission. And these volunteers helped bury those that had perished during the journey north and helped move the others into hospitals and camps. The soldiers were then given clothing by the Sanitary Commission. They also had their hair and beards trimmed and were taken to bathe. Their old clothes were steamed to kill bugs and disease and then sold for rags. Samuel Grosvenor, Company B, 16th Connecticut Volunteers, wrote in his diary that he had a splendid bath, after which I put on my new clothing and felt the most comfortable I had for the longest time. Now, while at Camp Parole, most found the time to be lazy with nothing to do but draw their back pay and rations. Those too ill or injured to remain in camp were sent to area hospitals and nursed back to health, and all were given a 30-day furlough before being sent back to their units. When they were fit enough, which according to the military officials meant you were able to travel, and after their furlough, the soldiers were moved to either the Washington Navy Yard or Camp Distribution here in Alexandria before being transported back to their units. The group that ultimately boarded the Massachusetts came here to Camp Distribution, which was a 6-hour march from Camp Parole. Now, Sunday morning, April 23rd, Booth and Herold are already in Virginia, and it's more than a week after Lincoln's assassination. The Black Diamond was following special orders to report to the Naval Depot at Piney Point, where they were to receive further instructions about joining the flotilla. So when the Black Diamond set off downriver, the weather that morning was sultry, with a northwest wind which brought out the sun. They left Alexandria and traveled the 92 miles to Piney Point, arriving there at about 11 p.m. There they were told to join the picket line near Blackistone Island. Today it's called St. Clement's Island. And they were to help prevent Booth and Herold from crossing the river. So they steamed the 13 miles back upriver and reached their duty station at approximately 12:35 on April 24th, where they anchored for the night. At 5 p.m. on that same Sunday evening, Captain Calk and Pilot Collison set out on the troop transport Massachusetts with 300 federal soldiers on board. The water on the river was calm to begin with. As the trip continued, the wind picked up and the waters became very rough shortly after dark. The moon, which was just a waning crescent, had set and was well below the horizon, making the night very dark. The men on board were sleeping, many on the open deck. Suddenly, they were awakened by a jolt and a loud noise. Traveling past Blackistone Island shortly before 1 a.m., the Massachusetts struck the Black Diamond on her port side near the boiler just aft of the wheelhouse and opened her iron hull right down to the waterline. The Massachusetts also sustained some damage, but it was not severe. Her bows were stove in above the waterline, leaving a hole large enough to take in 5 or 6 men abreast. In the dark, all became panic and confusion. Many men on board the Massachusetts, woken abruptly from their sleep, ran forward to see what had happened and found the bow filling with water. Some grabbed their coats, others their haversacks and equipment, and others went with just what they had been sleeping in. The captain ordered all on board to the stern in order to raise the damaged bow out of the water and keep them afloat. Seeing the other boat close by and still apparently afloat, the men began shouting to it to come closer and rescue them. And it was announced in a loud tone by an officer on board the Massachusetts to go on board the other boat. Some complied, fearing that the Massachusetts was about to go under. Some stayed put. Others jumped overboard into the water, grabbing planks and whatever they could find that would float. Now remember, these men were not many months out of prison, and also were in prison camp, and they were not in the best of health. They were healthy enough to travel. And the water temperature was probably well below 60 degrees at that time. A healthy swimmer might not get into life-threatening trouble at that temperature for 90 minutes, but most of these men would have been in trouble immediately, especially considering that when suddenly plunged into cold water, a naturally occurring gasping reflex can cause a person to drop straight to the bottom. Many of the survivors later related tales of being in the water for 3 hours or more, clinging to any bit of debris they could find and listening to the cries for help coming from others who had fallen or jumped into the river. Others wrote of watching their friends and fellow soldiers go down with the wrecked vessel. One survivor, George Hollins, wrote this: "A drummer boy of the 16th Connecticut had been washed overboard and had grasped hold of the keel of the boat or something else and was hanging on for dear life and calling for help. One of the crew up in the rigging," which I learned from another writing was Engineer Husted of the Black Diamond, "got hold of a rope and time again threw it to where the boy was, telling him to grab for it. The boy couldn't get hold of it. Every now and then a wave would wash over him and strangle him, and as he would emerge from it, he would call for the rope. He finally became exhausted and cried out to us that he could hold on no longer. He told us his name, George W. Carter. He said he was a drummer of Company B, 16th Connecticut, and asked us to inform his mother that he was drowned. He bade us goodbye, and as the next wave washed over him, he loosened his hold and sank beneath the waves. It was about 2 a.m. Hollins also wrote that he was among the first to jump from the Massachusetts onto the deck of the Black Diamond as it swung around, but he realized very quickly that it was severely damaged and that he had jumped out of the frying pan into the fire. So at the last moment, it came to him that the river was not deep enough to engulf the masts and all, so he grabbed one of the guy ropes and began climbing up toward the mast, and so he was saved. Another survivor wrote that he refused the order. He was ordered to jump, and he stayed put. And he said it was the only order he ever disobeyed in his term in the service, but still the disobeying of that order haunted him the rest of his life. Now, according to all of the survivors' accounts, the Black Diamond sank stern first, moments after the additional men got on board, in less than 8 minutes, and in 21 feet of water, creating a great dark hole in the water and leaving the cabin exposed above the surface of the river. Now, an article in the Pittsburgh Daily Commercial the following Wednesday reported that the Massachusetts succeeded in reaching Point Lookout in safety despite its being crippled. Everyone disembarked there, and when the soldiers were all counted, they found that they were 65 men short. Private Martin V. Culver, one of the survivors, wrote to his brother shortly after the accident to say that they finally reached Newbern, North Carolina, their final destination, the following Saturday, the 29th of April, after what he called a long and hard passage. Now, many newspapers of the day contained reports of the collision and the presumed number of dead, but bigger events in the news overshadowed this, causing it to be nearly lost to history. On April 21st, President Lincoln's funeral train had begun its travels west, so its progress was being followed inch by inch in the newspapers. Then on the 26th, the hunt for the assassins ended when Booth and Herold were cornered in the Garrett barn, and Booth was killed. And then on the 27th, the steamer Sultana exploded in the Mississippi River, resulting in the loss of 1,167 lives. George Hollins recalled, "We watched the New York papers a few days following the accident for an account of it, but I never saw any mention of it. In those days, however, the loss of a ship and a few men was not considered worth mentioning." Of the men aboard the Black Diamond, 6 were initially reported as lost, but ultimately it was found that 7 had drowned. Only 4 of their bodies were recovered, and those are the only 4 whose names have been found thus far: Peter Carroll, Christopher Farley, George Huntington, Samuel Gosnell. They were all members of the U.S. Steam Engine House here in Alexandria. And according to the Black Diamond's engineer, they had all volunteered to join this mission as part of the additional 10-man guard crew that was brought on just for this one trip. Now, compiling a list of the names of the men lost on the Massachusetts has been difficult because they came from so many different regiments. Inquiries were made of the government as early as 1925 in an effort to find a complete list, but none was ever found. So of the 80 known to have drowned from the Massachusetts, I've only identified 32, 33 so far. And of all the 87 men who were lost, only 37 bodies were recovered, despite the government's best efforts. The Washington Evening Star reported on May 1st that all efforts thus far to recover the bodies of the soldiers drowned in the Potomac River by the sinking of the propeller Black Diamond, which was run into off Blackistone Island a few days ago by the steamer Massachusetts, have been unsuccessful owing to the high water in the river. The number of lives lost by the sinking of the vessel has not been definitively ascertained as yet, but it is believed that at least 60 persons were drowned. The Black Diamond is entirely submerged in water with the exception of her smokestack and the upper part of her pilot house. She will doubtless be a total loss as she is an old vessel and would not hold together if attempts were made to raise her. And there were no attempts ever made to raise her. And we have gone looking for it and haven't found it, but it could still be down there. Now, since this incident fell under the Marine Risk Clause, not the War Risk Clause, the U.S. government took no responsibility for it, laid all at the feet of the owners. Now, it was impossible at first to determine where the blame lay, but Assistant Quartermaster Captain Lee had no doubt. He immediately wrote to the Quartermaster General that from what I can learn, the cause of the disaster was extreme carelessness of the pilot or master of the Massachusetts. But then in a second letter later that same day, he recommended that both captains and both pilots be arrested and brought to trial. Brigadier General Rucker and Secretary of War Stanton both agreed. Now, this was not without precedent. The legal responsibility of captains, pilots, engineers, and other persons employed on any steamboat for loss of life occasioned by their misconduct, negligence, or inattention to duty was first recognized in the Steamboat Act of 1838. The act stated that vessel operators could be charged for criminal manslaughter for deaths resulting from misconduct or negligence aboard vessels in the United States. And remember, at the beginning, we talked about what the duty of the pilots were. It was to keep safe the people on board. If convicted, the sentence was to be confinement at hard labor for a period of not more than 10 years. Vessel owners and public officers were added to the list of those that could be held criminally liable with the passage of the Steamboat Act of 1864. So they could have gone after everybody, but they didn't. Captain Meredith of the Black Diamond was arrested and held at the Central Guardhouse in Washington, D.C. He remained there until May 6th, when he was released with a written parole requiring him to appear whenever needed, presumably at the inquiry of the Board of Steamboat Inspectors. Now, Meredith was also serving as the pilot, which was not against the law, but was not necessarily the usual way of operating. Captain Calk and Pilot Collison of the Massachusetts were also put into the Central Guardhouse after being arrested on April 26th. Captain Calk was paroled on April 28th through the efforts of Assistant Attorney General A.E. King, who was a personal friend of his. King wrote a letter to the Provost Marshal, Ingraham, and said that he was sure that the accident was in no way caused by anything the captain had done, and he asked that Calk should be made as comfortable as possible. Now, while on parole, and until such time as he was called for, Calk was to report once a week to Major Gaines, who was the judge advocate in the Department of Washington. The 3rd Supervising District of Inspectors of Steam Vessels, which covered this area of the world, held an inquiry into this incident and submitted their findings to the National Board of Inspectors in October 1865 as part of their annual report. They reported that the board's investigation that both pilots wholly disregarded the rules established for their government. Consequently, their licenses were revoked. Now, unfortunately, those records were purged by the National Archives in the 50s with permission by Congress. No one had ever looked at them, so they thought, we don't need them. So I don't know why they made that decision. All we know is that the decision was made, but I'd love to know why. So I'm hoping somewhere, somebody, maybe in Baltimore at the local Steamship Inspectors Board, somebody's got those papers in their attic. It may happen, I don't know. Quartermaster Allen recommended that the Massachusetts should be discharged from military service due to its age. So that was done on June 10th, 1865. And it remained in passenger service then until 1880, when it was finally abandoned. Now, the 4 men serving on the Black Diamond, whose bodies were recovered, were brought to Alexandria for burial. Their comrades from the U.S. Steam Engine House felt that they deserved the honors shown to others who died in the line of duty. So they petitioned for these 4 civilians to be interred in the Alexandria National Cemetery. Their petition was granted, and the men were buried in the federal cemetery on May 10th, 1865, after a procession from the engine house to the cemetery. The fire department, the federal government, and the city authorities all worked together on the funeral arrangements. A memorial was placed in their honor by fellow members of the government steam engine company in November 1865. And this is right at the entrance to the cemetery, and their individual markers are lined up right behind this memorial. Now, the men from the Black Diamond were not eligible for pensions since they were serving as civilians. But many of the widows and mothers of the men drowned from the Massachusetts, who were actually Union soldiers, were ultimately able to receive pensions. But in order to do so, those whose loved ones were not returned to them had to rely on the depositions of survivors who had witnessed the incident and the drowning to prove that they had died. Now, in some cases, the regimental officers were able to testify even though they hadn't been on board, but they were able to say, no, we knew he was getting on board, he never got off, he's not been back. This is what we assume happened. Mothers who had relied on the money sent home by their sons had to further prove that they had been dependent on their son's income. So it was often the town postmistress who attested to them for that, having handled all their incoming mail, and then ministers were called on to testify to the marriage and the birth of the children. It was not bad enough that they didn't get a body, they then had to go through all of this misery. Now, Clara Barton came to their aid ultimately. She approached Congress in 1869 and asked that it make a declaration of death for all soldiers still missing and unknown, so their families could finally have closure and could seek financial relief through the pension system, and that was successful. The Alexandria Gazette reported that regular steamboat service on the Potomac River had resumed in May of 1865. And Alexandria was happy to welcome several of our old Maryland and Virginia friends who have come to town, as in the old times, to purchase supplies. So your store owners were real happy. The prisoner of war camp at Point Lookout closed in June, and the Potomac Flotilla was put out of service on July 31st, 1865. The war was finally over in Maryland. On December 6, 1865, Brigadier General Wise suggested that the poem Ode, written at the beginning of the year 1746, also known as How Sleep the Brave, be used in conjunction with any publication of the names of the soldiers lost in the collision between Black Diamond and Massachusetts. So there was the poem, you can read yourself. And I and the St. Mary's County Museum Division are doing what we can to make sure that these men and their sacrifices are honored and that this incident will never be forgotten again. In 2020, Civil War Trails put up a marker in recognition of the collision on the mainland just opposite Blackistone Island on the grounds of the St. Clements Island Museum. And every April we hold a wreath-laying ceremony and event to honor the men whose lives were lost that day. And I have gone out with divers looking for the wreck, and there's thousands of ships on the bottom of the Potomac, and it's been thus far impossible. Now, since publishing my book, I've learned a couple of things. I had another researcher send me the name of another soldier who was lost in the incident, Henry H. Goodrich of the 2nd Washington, D.C. Volunteer Infantry. And I learned the name of the pilot on the Massachusetts. So today I called him Pilot Charles Collison, but in the book he's just simply the pilot. I didn't have his name yet. And in the book, I identified the captain of the Massachusetts as Captain Couch, because that's what it says in that newspaper article. The only article that mentioned the captain by name, but his actual name was Calk. So I was looking up Captain Couch. I could find nothing on this man. And finally, another researcher found the arrest record that I showed you earlier, and he said, I think his name was Calk. And sure enough, you look up Calk, and there's all kinds of information about him. So today I called him by the right name. And I also, since publishing the book, found that Captain Meredith was serving as both the captain and the pilot, which is why I couldn't find the pilot's name. So my work is not done. I have got some unanswered questions. I want to find more of the names. I want to identify the rest of the men who were lost. It's not done yet, but I am determined. And I have help. Catherine and David have been really helpful. I met them during this whole process, and we chat a lot about all of this. And there are just people that reach out. The more the book sells, the more people read it, the more the CNN show gets showed, people do contact me, and it really is wonderful to have help from all around the area. But now it's your turn. Do you have questions for me? Yes, sir.
I might have missed it. Where exactly geographically is the site of the wreck?
It's right by Blackistone Island, which if the Potomac from here goes straight south, and then it does this and goes due east. It's about halfway down that lower stretch. So it's St. Mary's County, which is opposite Westmoreland County, if you know where that is on the Virginia side. Okay, it's down there. About halfway from that big turn in the river to the mouth of the river. It's down in that area. Yeah. That island also is where the Lord Baltimore and his people first landed in 1634 when they founded the state of Maryland. So it's kind of an important island. Yes?
You mentioned Commander John Ward earlier in your talk. And of course, we had Fort Ward named after him. Do you recall when he was lost and how? It was early in the war.
It was very early. It was right around the time that those, after First Manassas, when the batteries were showing up, and it was the battle of, I think it was at Aquia Creek was actually the battle. And he was killed at that point. Funny story about that. His funeral was a big deal in Washington at the Navy Yard. They pulled every boat from the flotilla up to the Navy Yard for his funeral. There was a gentleman from Lower Maryland called Zarvona. He had this grand idea. He was going to capture the flagship of the flotilla. So he dressed as a woman along with all of his Confederates. They dressed as women. They got on the steamships in Baltimore, Annapolis, all over the place with guns under the massive petticoats. So they're kind of hiding their faces. They're getting on. Everything's fine. They capture the steamship they're on, and we're going to use that to take the bigger vessel. So they get into the Potomac. The ships are all gone because they didn't know the funeral was happening for Commander Ward up in Washington that day. So they all just turned the boat back over and went home. So the only funny thing about Commander Ward's funeral. Yes?
I'm sure everybody in the room knows more about this than I do, but I grew up in South Carolina. For those of us who know Southern Maryland that think about where John Wilkes Booth crossed over, it's near, like, say, where Captain Dilley's seat.
Correct.
Right, so did he cross there first and then was taken north
Yes.
and then come back?
Yes.
So this was all set up that they had people there waiting, and so,
Yes.
so this was really a whole network was set up
Yes.
to save
Exactly, exactly, on both sides of the river. And when he first got to the south side of the river, of the next river, they got over down to the Rappahannock. They went to a safe house, but the gentleman wasn't home, and his sisters wouldn't let them in because they didn't want men in the house without their brother at home. So he had to go find another house. So he didn't have it as easy as he thought he was going to have it once he got into Virginia. Maryland side, not a problem. He was helped every bit of the way. That was not a problem. But, yeah. Yes?
Would you explain again, so the Massachusetts lost the most men,
Correct.
but did they lose the men because of the collision, or were they getting on to the Black Diamond and therefore they helped to sink it?
Some were actually thrown overboard by the collision. Some jumped onto the Black Diamond and went over. Some jumped into the water thinking the Massachusetts was sinking and just didn't make it. Some because most people at that time didn't know how to swim. They also weren't dressed for swimming. If they had grabbed their coats and haversacks and went in the water, they weigh a lot. And I didn't know this, but I gave a talk at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and they talked about when you jump into cold water like that you do gasp, which fills you up with water and gas, and I don't know all the details, but it takes you right to the bottom. And the Potomac is very muddy on the bottom, so you might have gotten your feet stuck, but they said also it had happened so fast, you can get like the bends kind of thing, and you're just dead. So lots of different ways. Yeah, yes?
Early in your talk, you mentioned that in southern Maryland at night, people were smuggling people and supplies. To where? Why were they doing that?
They were going over to Virginia because Virginia needed medicine, Virginia needed food, Virginia needed help. So doctors were sending supplies. They were sending newspapers. Within 24 hours of a cabinet meeting in Washington, D.C., Richmond knew what had happened because the line of communication among the spies was so good that they were doing that. But quinine was a big deal. That was they arrested Dr. Mudd for helping Booth. He did help Booth. He should have helped Booth. He was a doctor. Booth needed help. But he was on that line. He was sending newspapers and drugs south. So he was guilty of spying and things. So he didn't necessarily get arrested for the right crime, but he was not innocent in this whole situation. He was smuggling a lot of drugs south, to help the Confederacy. And salt was a big thing. They were hoarding salt in St. Mary's County to take across to Virginia. So, anything else? Well, if you think of something later, there's my there's my email, or you can take a card. Thank you so much. Great crowd.
All right, the Alexandria Historical Society would like to thank Karen Stone. No wonder you won that award, because you're really helping to keep this part of history afloat. I've been working on that. Okay. So before I let you go, I'm going to remind you of our upcoming event next week. On Friday, we're going to be at the Athenaeum, not the Lyceum, the Athenaeum. Shield your eyes, but open your ears, because we're going to be at the Athenaeum. The doors open at 6:30. The event is at 7 o'clock. This is next Friday night on the 5th. And then the week after that is Sails on the Potomac. You're all going to Sails on the Potomac. So on Saturday, you want to stop by the Historical Society tent. We're going to be there all day. It's 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. We're going to be there all day. So you don't feel like you need to come volunteer the whole day. Come volunteer for 1 hour, 2 hour, hang out with us, swap stories. You can check out the digital museum, take our history quizzes. We're going to have map games. And your questions, answers, stump the society, because we want to hear you. One more thing before I let you go. I want to focus your attention to the high school student with the camera in the back there. Her name is Christy. She is a senior. She is about to graduate high school, and she's going to Virginia Tech. So give her a hand. say hi to her on the way out, and if you want to volunteer, send us an email. And if you want to become a member of the Historical Society, see one of our board members in the back. And thank you very much, and have a great night.